A Conversation on Consciousness with Michael Cerullo. Dr. Michael Cerullo is a practicing psychiatrist affiliated with the University of Cincinnati Medical Center and the Cincinnati Institute for Cognitive Science. Dr. Cerullo specializes in the scientific study of consciousness and the problem of personal identity, and is a scientific advisor to the Brain Preservation Foundation. In recent work, Dr. Cerullo has examined the philosophical implications of whole brain emulation and mind uploading, as in his Minds and Machines paper, Uploading and Branching Identity. Applying the concept of branching identity, Dr. Cerullo addresses questions that arise when considering a successful mind uploading procedure and further copying following whole brain emulation. Thank you very much for joining us, Mike. This is Michael Cerullo. I'm not going to do the full introduction right now because I will come up with a proper introduction and paste that in front of this video.
Okay.
Thank you very much for joining us.
I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, thank you. I'm going to dive right in. As you know, I've had some conversations with various people about consciousness at this point, and our main interest is not just to understand consciousness from the philosopher's point of view, but from the point of view of someone who's interested in whole brain emulation. So in the concept that you can take the basics of how your brain is constructed and how it creates you, and then reinstantiate it in some other form, whether it's a computer of some kind or some other machine, and then exist again or continue to exist. That's the most important thing, really. We would want to continue to exist in that case. And so we're interested in consciousness from a very practical point of view. And if you don't mind, I'm going to throw the hard ball at you right away. Could you define consciousness for us, please?
Well, that's a good place to start. And I kind of have the similar background. I mean, I have a background in science, but I've just become, always very interested in the philosophical aspect and sort of their interaction. So I think we have to define consciousness in two ways. The first way is third person consciousness, so that if I was an alien or a Martian and I was looking at humans, how would I define consciousness? And I could use the data to come up with, these organisms talk about themselves. They talk about having something called consciousness. And then I get into what does it do biologically? It allows them to have global access to information, all its sort of high level executive um, behavior that it allows. And so you have that third person perspective. And then from my other side, sort of the philosophical perspective, I think you have the first person consciousness, and that's where people get into, qualia, what it's like, and almost things that really are almost impossible to explain unless you have them yourself. So I think that's where you have to start. You have to break it into first and third person consciousness.
Mm-hmm. Is there such a thing as second person consciousness?
Um, I have
No.
not
Okay.
thought of that. No.
Fine. We can move on from there. Yeah, so first person and third person consciousness. And I think typically people will, well, maybe not everyone. I'm not sure how Deepak Chopra feels about this, but most people will feel that third person consciousness is not a very complicated thing in terms of how we define it and how we approach it, especially if you're thinking of something like, can we give a machine consciousness, or um, can we achieve whole brain emulation and upload people? Um, the third person consciousness is often not the one that people will argue about, but it's the first person consciousness, right?
Well, yeah, and David Chalmers sort of broke this up into the easy problem, which is sort of third person consciousness. I want to maybe talk about that a little bit. And then the hard problem, which is the first person consciousness. Although I think the deeper you dig into this area, the more these sort of get closer and closer. Third person and the first person kind of getting closer and closer together.
Okay, well, if you'd like to dig into, if you want to give us a little bit of a background on third person consciousness so that we understand its
Yeah,
importance.
so third person consciousness is, and I think this is key too, is this is what you're going to get through the scientific study of consciousness. So And third person consciousness does not exclude, like, you don't say, oh, it's third person, you don't therefore talk about feeling and emotion and inner life. I think that's actually not true. From a third person perspective, you would say there's this, organism called Randall, and he's, got this inner life from my perspective, and he has thoughts, and and you could call him qualia. I mean, you could say he's got qualia. And when I ask him, you're looking at this red painting, what do you see? What do you describe? And I think most 99% of people in this debate would agree that, that third person consciousness can explain all of our behavior. There's no, causal function of this mysterious qualia. We're not looking at any kind of substance property. We're saying that, the mind supervenes on the brain. It's everything's neurological. And for everything that you tell me that you experience or that you feel, there's going to be a neural correlate or some kind of physical correlate to that behavior.
So you would count all of these sort of report of awareness and attention, things like what have I just heard, what have I seen, what have I been thinking about, what are my plans, all of this would fall into third person consciousness in the sense that all of what describes the way that is, the way that those things happen, the behavioral part of it, that all falls into third person consciousness?
Yes, there's biological and neurological explanation for all of that. Now the trick is, so you say, well, what are you talking about first person consciousness? Well, that is where, I'm no longer talking about you, I'm talking about myself and my own experience. And of course, I assume that you and everyone else has this similar experience, but that's a different kind of knowledge. Unfortunately, the only person that I'm absolutely sure that has first person consciousness is myself. I mean, that's, and it's kind of tricky because, we're not talking about solipsism. I mean, I don't want to say that no one else has consciousness, but it's more of, maybe it's epistemology. It's just, how can I know for sure? First person consciousness is something that, I experienced for myself. And of course, everything I know is filtered through this conscious lens. And so that's, that's the kind of tricky part, because, you've got that. And yet, even for myself, I mean, I'm not saying that, I'm sure that from your perspective, you could explain everything I'm doing neurologically. I'm not saying there's any special causality that I have that this first person consciousness has. So then you get into a trick, then you say, well, what's the point? Is it just epiphenomenon? And, it's kind of what I'm saying, but then that, that runs into real problems where it just seems to be a big causal coincidence in the universe that my first person experience just happens to coincide perfectly with all of this third person consciousness. And, that doesn't seem right.
Right. Yeah.
They seem more closely connected. And I think that, I don't have an answer for that. I think that's sort of the cutting edge of where, thought and philosophy and neuroscience is going. And then can I throw out some about the meta problem of consciousness as well?
Please do. I was about to start asking you about things like, I was going to say, so, from Chalmers' point of view, when he talks about P-zombies, philosophical zombies, would you be able to say that those are creatures that experience only third person?
Exactly. And that's the big question, is everyone in the universe, or uploads, or computers, are they all going to be, P-zombies that just have third person consciousness? And how do you tell the difference?
How do we know that we don't just have, how do we know that we're not P-zombies?
Well, see, that's an interesting question. And I think this gets into a little bit of Keith Frankish and his paper on illusionism, and Daniel Dennett, I guess, has been kind of discussing this for a long time. But Frankish coins the term illusionism, where consciousness is actually all an illusion. So that he wants to say that our first person consciousness is exactly what you say. It is an illusion. There's nothing but third person consciousness.
Yeah.
And I think that's an interesting idea, and I think it's certainly possible, but I think that's moving beyond the data that we have. I think that's taking a metaphysical position and not a scientific position.
Sure. Now, I personally find that I mean, I understand why it's problematic because you don't want to claim that what we're experiencing isn't real in some sense, but I find it an attractive thought, or at least an attractive way to approach the problem, because you know our senses and what we think is going on and our intuitions, they often mislead us in the sense that the data that's being provided to us is data that our brain has put together in a certain way for us to interpret in a certain way and has already labeled in a certain way. So, and this ties in a bit with my conversation with Michael Graziano the other day.
Hmm.
Um, you know, it wouldn't be too strange to claim that perhaps we are all P zombies in the sense that the machine that is testing itself, that is asking the question, am I conscious? Is that me being aware right now? Is giving itself that answer. So it doesn't have another judge there to tell it whether that answer is right or wrong. So if it puts the label, yes, I'm conscious, this is me feeling this, I am a conscious
Hmm.
being somewhere, then of course it believes that because that's what it gets, right?
Exactly, and I think they're actually maybe winning a little bit of the argument. Dennett and Graziano, um, and then let me come back to the meta problem. So the meta problem is the problem of why do we, as human beings, always talk about or obsess about these qualia, these first person experiences. And what Graziano is trying to do is look, you need like a self model, you need some kind of model of the organism, which will explain, because I mean that's what I totally 100% agree with. There is a physical explanation of why we obsess over these experiences, and I think that's where illusionism is actually very, very strong argument. As again, looking at this third person, you sort of look at, well, what do we need for this? What do we even need with the first person consciousness? And it's hard, and I definitely feel like sometimes I'm in, kind of in the corner here trying to defend this. And so all I can go back to is say, well, step back to the first person experience. And again, not talking about you or anybody else, just my own experience. Then I can get back to talking about, qualia and this subjective experience. And, um, and I think that is the sort of the big struggle that we're having, is that I'm not ready to give that up, even though I, completely agree with the meta problem and the supervenience of consciousness. And it's tricky. I mean, often I don't know how to defend that. And then it goes back to the arguments about vitalism, in the 19th century, where people thought life was some kind of vital force, and this is a good analogy for consciousness. And those are all great arguments, but I think there's something different about experience. And again, I can't provide scientific arguments. I think we're stepping back into a metaphysical argument. But then the trick is, this is not just some airy philosophy. This is crucial questions where you get into uploading and computers, and are they conscious or not? And I think you also step back into issues like ethics. I mean, all of our ethics depend on. I mean, not everyone would say this, but I think a lot of philosophers and ethicists would say that all of our ethics depends on consciousness, depends on the reality of suffering. And if we're not talking about third person suffering,
Hmm.
and the similar, you step back to, um, all their aspects of human experience, literature, art, all these things, we're not talking about third person art, we're talking about first person. And what I like about Frank is she talks about, I can't remember, there was like pseudo qualia or some term that he talks about to mean third person qualia. So, you could step back and say that, I mean, on one hand, physicalism seems to explain the whole universe. I mean, that's, it's hard to defend against that. It's all just one big, wave function. But again, you step back to this first person experience, and, you've got, not only qualia, but you've got, ethical thoughts, you've got art, you've got meaning. And, a lot of people bite the bullet and just say, well, forget it. It's all just, physicalism. It's not just supervenience. That's what it is. But I just find that a bit hard to. I mean, maybe we'll turn out to understand. Maybe that will be true. It'll make more sense in the future, and that's what Kenneth Hayworth was. We were having a conversation, and he was saying that you know maybe in the future, what we need to do is somehow have further understanding what this all makes sense. And I can understand that, that would be one thing. Um, but to me, I just don't think we're there. I mean, I think there's still that gap,
Mhm.
which is a problem, because then for people like us who are interested in uploading artificial intelligence, all these questions, how can we really be sure?
Yeah.
And I don't think that, I mean, I'm not saying that we can't be sure. I think we just have to, um, to our theories of consciousness, our scientific theories, we just have to take a position in the philosophy or the fundamental foundational issues, which some people would call metaphysics. And I've done this a little bit in my writing, where that, um, like you have to look at functionalism. You just have to say that for some reason, this first person experience goes along with the third person experience. We don't quite know why, but that seems to be the way it is. So we can generalize that to computers, to uploading. Um, that's kind of my thought. I mean, I guess I worry about, um, people like Daniel Dennett or Keith Frankish, where I think they're making good arguments, but I think they're not often acknowledging that they're making metaphysical arguments where, they're going beyond the data. I mean, you have to take a
Mm.
stance, and they've good analogies and good, basically metaphysical reasoning, and I think that's fair. But you're pushing the data.
Yeah. Now it's clear that there's a lot of data missing, so it's too early to I think, to draw any final conclusions. Although we all have some sense of which camp we kind of feel we belong in, and which approach we think is going to make more inroads. So, because I had a conversation with Mike Johnson about their what he calls physicalist approach to qualia and other things, I'm going to ask you something about that in a moment because you won't have a chance to talk to him in person
Mhm.
during our event. But before I do, since we're sort of on the topic, I was wondering if you could tell me a little bit about what you think makes for a good theory of consciousness. What does a say if you think about theories that you've read about, which ones you would consider good and which ones you consider bad and why? What are the different ways that they go about setting about their making a
Mhm.
theory?
Well, yeah, I think, well, for starters, and I guess I could illustrate this with two examples. Talk a little bit about integrated information theory, and maybe a little bit about Michael Graziano or Thomas Mettinger and their self models, or Bernie Barr's global
Hmm.
workspace. So
Yeah,
what I like about, and then Graziano, I guess it's ASC. I forget what
yes,
exactly
that's
his model
correct. Yeah,
stands
yeah.
for. And
It's
Barr's global workspace,
attention something theory.
schematic
Yeah,
theory,
attention schema
maybe.
theory. That's it. Yeah.
Those are good scientific theories, and I say that because they actually look at and explain third person consciousness. Because whatever else consciousness is, clearly it's part of the brain, part of the organism, part of the natural world. It evolved for very specific purposes. It had very specific functions. And I don't think we totally understand all of that. I mean, part of the science is understanding what consciousness is from a third person perspective. We can't just use phenomenology and figure this all out. I mean, like you said, um, all these fascinating studies in perception and all these illusions, and
Hmm.
it's very complicated. You can't just figure this out from the armchair. Um, and there's various specific questions. So those theories look at third person consciousness. They're good scientific theories. They can make predictions. And you can also, and just because you believe in one of those theories doesn't mean you have to not talk about the hard problem, about these other issues. You can take like this self model and say, well, this explains the meta problem of consciousness. We can explain why we talk about having these experiences that can't be explained by science. I mean, that has a
Yeah.
scientific explanation. And then you can go further, and as part of those theories, you can get into the foundational issues, or to use the dirty word metaphysics, which scientists absolutely hate that, but you can call it foundational issues. But then you can sort of talk about um, these other issues of the hard problem in first person consciousness, and say that, well, we don't, I admit there's a problem there, but clearly the data is showing us that the brain, that consciousness is this or this function, so that if you did this in an upload or a computer, then there's no reason to think you would not have that first person experience, whether it exists or not. you can attach that to it. Now, let me go to some other theories. I mean, you've got Stuart Hameroff and Roger Penrose, the quantum consciousness, and then I would put IIT, Integrated Information Theory, in this same boat too, where they want to start with first-person consciousness. They want to start with the mysterious, the unknowable, the qualia, all these kind of things, and sort of attach it to science peripherally. And the problem with those theories is they tell us absolutely nothing about third-person consciousness. It's all ad hoc. And so, they're doomed to fail because that's not what science does. I mean, you can't start at the first person, create some kind of theory, because that's not where science is. We don't have that kind of information understanding. So, I think from the start, you're going nowhere with that kind of approach. And I mean, there's some subtleties. I mean, I know Christoph would sort of argue that, oh no, we're taking, data and this and that. But I think fundamentally, that's where they're wrong, is they're starting with first person consciousness, which that's not scientific. I mean, you don't have the understanding or the data or information to start from there and then get into, work backwards into science.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Okay. So that would then be not the right approach to getting to a good theory of consciousness. All right. So I guess I'll just say a few words about what I heard from Mike Johnson. Their approach is to think that really you can, when you go about a new area of science, sometimes you end up with something complicated, something where you need to describe what's going on in terms of a mechanism that utilizes fundamental things that we understand about physics that are more fundamental, but utilizes them in a complex way, like a machine, where things are put together and they're a complex whole. And sometimes you can discover that things that you had measured, phenomena you had observed, ultimately point to something that can be described by a formalism that can be much more universally applicable and simple to perhaps describe in some sense. So his example was, take, for instance, the sort of machine was on one side, but on the other side, various phenomena of electricity and light and magnetic force, and then electromagnetism came out of that, right? That's the formalism that then gives you the sort of description, the fundamental description in physics terms about what's going on here, and then you can apply that to everything else, and then you can use it to create new things. And so it's funny, he was talking about, he was actually giving examples about, say, the elan vital. Of course, that's an example where that sort of thinking went wrong, right? The thinking was there is something very fundamental there that is at the bottom of what life is, whereas in reality, you've got this complex machine, and if something breaks, then it doesn't work anymore, and that's where life ends. So elan vital turned out to be wrong, but he's betting that that consciousness and other mental phenomena are different in a sense, that there is something fundamental there that we're going to discover is somehow describable in a very formalist way, rather than the life example, that it's more like the electromagnetism example. Now, personally, I'm not in that camp. I'm a functionalist, and therefore I really think that many of these issues that we're having right now have more to do with the fact that we simply haven't collected enough information yet, enough data yet. We haven't put all the bits and pieces together, and so if we feel like, oh, this direction, this way of doing reductionist science to come up with the results isn't working, then it's because we're too impatient, because it's a very complicated thing we have here, the brain. It doesn't mean we have to discover a new physics to explain it. We just have to doggedly keep on going until we can point out how the machine works. That's my approach to it. And so, I don't necessarily agree with them, but this is the approach that the QRI are taking. There is some sort of basic physics there that we haven't yet understood, but that can be described through some formalism. So that's
okay.
it.
So not too far from maybe what Penrose or Hameroff. I mean, looking at some.
Yeah, there's a
Looking for
similarity
something.
there. He likes to mention Max Tegmark because Max Tegmark seems to
Yeah,
be
he's done a little bit of that kind of speculation. He actually takes integrated information theory and tries to generalize it to all of physics, which I think is kind of interesting.
Right.
Like, look, take it back to the fundamental level, and you kind of get into panpsychism, and those are interesting questions. I guess my concern is you with those speculations, you get farther and farther away from neuroscience and third person consciousness. But as far as the analogies, the vitalism, just the history of science, everything we thought is something fundamental or different, turns out to be no. It's just the chemistry. Life is just a chemical reaction. And again, I don't think there's any question that we're going to find out that consciousness completely supervenes on the brain. There's no microtubules or some kind of magical causal power of quantum mechanics that gets beyond computability and all that kind of stuff. So I don't have any doubt that neuroscience will get us there, but there's still these lagging questions. And I think maybe another analogy too is to say that start with physics. They have the same issues because you get into these foundational sciences and fundamental physics. You've got quantum mechanics, and you've got where the data will get you. And people often, physicists just would say, like Niels Bohr said, okay, that's it. There's nothing behind the data. The Copenhagen interpretation. You're just getting calculations, and that's what it is. But that wasn't satisfying. A lot of people were not happy with that, and through the decades after the quantum mechanics was first formulated, people started to realize that, these are interesting questions, and actually lead to further testing, and you can actually do some more experiments. You can actually move this along. So I think that might be a better analogy of where we are with consciousness, is that one approach, the physicalism or illusionism, is that there is no qualia. Don't ask those questions. And maybe that's true, but I think and my own opinion is that we need to keep asking these questions, and what is behind reality, and a lot of these, and that gets us into realism versus anti-realism, which again is the dirty word philosophy. But you have to take these positions. I mean, you have to. And what's interesting even about illusionism is that it's parallel to free will. I mean, even if you believe in illusionism, you don't have to be an anti-realist about consciousness or the self. You just have to redefine what that means. That's just extremely complicated self models that there's no illusion there. I mean, it really is an organism that has this data that is some form of self, that doesn't have to be an illusion. I think that it's part of is the way you look at it. And, maybe that's a little bit of human psychology. We all sort of have our own perspective. But I think it parallels the free will debate. I mean, even if you don't deny the reality of the causal closure of physics, you don't have to believe in determinism. I mean, it's a lot more complicated than that.
Right. Yeah. So one of the things that I would hope for is, for instance, if you can explain how the brain builds a self model, and you can explain, say, if I ask myself the question, what am I aware of right now? That if I can explain the functions that are producing the response, that are giving me the result, and why they create a certain, they stimulate areas that would normally be associated with other senses that I'm having, but they're sort of reactivating them so that I can experience what I was just aware of, or something like that. If I have a very detailed understanding of what's happening in that moment as I ask myself, what am I aware of right now? And, here I am, or something like that. That if I get that description, and if I can carry out a transformation of coordinates where I put myself in the position of the first person, that would give me an explanation that is so coherent and clear that then you can understand that, the only difference between the third person and first person approach is that transformation of coordinates, the fact that you are the process that asked that question and received that response. I'm still not sure if this would be satisfying for everyone, but it feels to me like that's the kind of thing I'd be hoping for.
Yeah, I mean, I think I've heard people sort of say similar, kind of similar things, and and I've kind of been pushed closer and closer with articles like Keith Frankish and Thomas talking about the meta problem. I mean, being pushed closer and closer to, I mean, the third person, the first person are getting closer and closer, and maybe there will be, like you said, some kind of transformation that will make it all clear. And I think Kenneth Hayworth used this example of like evolution, before Darwin. I mean, you couldn't really even conceive how that was possible. And he was saying that, maybe there'll be similar, because I think that's where we are. I mean, it's hard to conceive of where first person and third person, kind of come together. But maybe we just need the next, Charles Darwin of the mind to put that together. We'll be like, oh, that makes perfect sense. The trick is, we're not there yet. I think you have to take a stand on one of these positions. Now, the good news for uploading and computer AI and everything like that is that, personally, I think you can get pretty good explanations and you could get pretty good justifications or generalizations of what's going to be third person and first person consciousness. Now, Christoph Koch would of course disagree with me because of, the IIT makes all these predictions about, feed forward networks and this and that aren't conscious. And I think, to me, again, that's the wrong approach. You can't even go down that road because you're ignoring third person consciousness. So if your theory can't even explain that, then you're off to the wrong start. So I don't buy into your predictions. And so if you want to start with self-model theories, I think then you can generalize and you can make really good arguments that whatever your theories, whatever your worries are, that if you make like an uploader, you make a similar system that has third-person consciousness, then everything we know about our universe is going to say that first-person consciousness is going to follow. I mean, you still have those questions of, well, what is first-person consciousness and all those metaphysical questions, but for pragmatics and for engineering, I think you can still make what matters most is you can make those predictions that, this has whatever we have. And again, this goes back to the, I can only talk about myself. I mean, I have these first person experiences, and, whatever I have, I can use these theories to generalize that, well, it's fair to assume that these other people, as well as these other computers or uploads, would have the same thing too, if it, and you can even step back further and say, if it exists, and you can even take that level of skepticism about your own experience.
Yep. So to kind of bring it all back to mind uploading as we're finishing up, I guess I'd like to ask, so let's talk specifically about the issue of surviving mind uploading.
Mm-hmm.
What does it take to survive mind uploading? I mean, does it make any difference whether you are doing the so-called scan and copy where you record something and then you produce the recreated brain, or you do some other approach?
Well, now we're getting into a whole nother topic, because not only, I think the two most difficult questions are consciousness and then personal identity. And so, that is a whole nother question. So I think you could make good arguments that uploads or computers would be conscious. And then you throw in personal identity, and that's a whole nother set of questions. Again, I think you can make arguments
Let's not
of
dive too deep into that, but it would be good to understand
the difference, maybe.
Yes, how you define the difference between consciousness and personal identity.
That's a very good
consciousness and
that's a very good question. So, I mean, I think consciousness, you would define as maybe in the moment. I mean, it's one period of time where you can say you're conscious. And then identity, you're starting to get into diachronic issues where over time, how am I the same consciousness over time? That, I think, is what identity is all about.
When you say consciousness is in the moment, how do we know that it is an in the moment experience where we are, say, suddenly conscious of what we're hearing and seeing, etc., and that it's not really a process where what we're seeing and hearing has been put together into a self model and then deposited in a working memory buffer, and we're just querying that?
Well, I think I definitely would say that that's true. So I think we could talk about the as William James talked about, the specious present, the 3 seconds or whatever period of time where you seem to be able to hold things in working memory, and you be able to hold a moment of time. And then you get into, beyond that, you get into skeptical questions of, well, is your whole existence just a false implanted memory, and you've just been created in the last 3 seconds? And then that is the same kind of question about personal identity. And I think that's, consciousness not only is hard enough, but then personal identity, I think, is one step maybe above that, where then you're not only talking about consciousness, but you're adding other variables in there, and so it gets really tricky.
Yeah, yeah, that is definitely tricky, and I'm trying to pin it down a bit because I know that these two topics are often used almost interchangeably, I suppose, because many people will just inherently assume that personal identity has something to do with a continuous stream of consciousness or
Hmm.
a continuation of their subjective first-person consciousness, something of that nature. And so I think it's inevitable that we have to raise this question at some point about what is the difference between, or how do they relate to each other, or what is the additional parameter or additional variable that you're talking about when you talk about personal identity. And I know it's difficult, but we'll start to chip away at it, and maybe you have one little bit you'd like to chip away at right now.
That's a, well, yeah. I guess I would say that I actually use the same approach. I actually wrote an article about this very question about first identity. I actually go back and say, well, you need to look at first person personal identity and third person personal identity, because they're separate questions, and you're never going to be able to, or at least at this stage, we don't have the scientific understanding to talk about first person identity. I know that the lingo gets really complicated here. So actually take the very similar approach to consciousness and just say, what can we say about third person identity, which we can say a lot. I mean, you get into some of the classic writings on identity and the psychological theory and all these kind of things, which seem to be the right answer. I mean, the psychological theory. And then you have to speculate a little bit. You have to push the boundaries of foundation, or, again, the dirty word metaphysics, and make some other arguments about, okay, what is the connection between third and first person identity? And can we make predictions? And I think that's where you need to go to start making predictions about, uploading. But then you get a little bit trickier, because then you get into things like branching and things that we have no intuitive experience with, and then it can become even more tricky. So you have to speculate a little bit further. And I mean, I guess there's always dangers of when you're looking at metaphysical arguments of things that are so far beyond your own experience. um, then you're really stretching things too. But
Mm.
certainly a lot of fun for the identity argument. So, but that's a whole nother
It is certainly a
interview
whole
or
other
topic.
yeah, and I think we're going to go down that road. I have a feeling that we're beginning to tackle these questions one at a time, and we'll get into personal identity specifically as well. Um, so you personally, do you feel that something like a mind uploading procedure would preserve or allow you to survive in a personal identity framework? Something like, I know you've written about branching identity, and I wonder
Yeah.
if it's in there.
Well, I mean, I think it can. Then you get into the question of destructive versus non-destructive uploading, and what are the differences. And I guess to be a little more humble or honest, I mean, I guess it's hard to say answer those questions when you're talking about branching. When you're talking about survival and continuation. I think it's a harder question, but I do think, yeah, I mean, I think you can make good arguments that absolutely, you do get survival. And I guess what I would say the most conservative, which approach is like gradual uploading. I mean, I think that would be a very conservative approach where you could make the best arguments. The problem is, of course, that's not possible. You need to do right now. The best we could do is maybe brain preservation and serial scanning, which is destructive uploading. And you know, is that going to fit with the branching identity? Um, and I mean, I guess I would say that I give it a 50-50, with the philosophical, that would be, maybe that means I know absolutely nothing, or it mean, what does the 50-50 mean? But I can see both ways, I guess is
Yeah.
what I'm saying. I mean, it certainly could. And I don't think you could give it a 0. I think that would be totally incorrect. But I also think it'd be totally incorrect to say there's 100% certainty that destructive uploading would, um, satisfy all those criteria of the first person personal identity. So it's somewhere between 0 and 100%. How's that?
Okay, there you go. That's you've really left yourself a lot of room, but that's fine.
And I put it about 50, but
Okay. Okay.
I change every day. Some days I go down, some days I go
Yeah, I
up.
mean,
But
strictly speaking, this last question wasn't even really a consciousness related question, so you're
well,
going beyond where we're going with the talk right now. Yeah, so thank you very much. Is there anything that you feel that I haven't asked about that listeners should know that maybe you wanted to mention?
I think we covered what's the key, for people like us who are interested in, uploading and questions of artificial intelligence. But there's such a great literature, and I would definitely encourage scientists just to not, metaphysics is not a dirty word. Philosophy of mind is not, go and review that, because I think, again, that science and certainly modern analytical philosophy. I mean, there's a lot of merging there, and it's similar discussions. And I think that all those classical questions we maybe haven't talked about, identity theory versus this kind of theory, and dualisms, property dualism. I think the more you know about those things, the more it'll help you with um, these kind of debates.
Hmm. Okay. Well, thank you very much. It's been
Yep.
wonderful having you on.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye bye.